Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's episode of Experts of the Americas. My name is Stephanie Ávalos, and I'm Deputy Director of External Affairs and Development at the Atlantic Council's Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center. Today, I'm excited to host the first episode of a four-part series of conversations that will explore one of the most important but often misunderstood shifts happening in the hemisphere. Why Latin America and the Caribbean are increasingly turned to Chinese investment, and what that means for US-LAC relations in a more multipolar world. This is episode one, and I am thrilled to start out this series with Victoria Chonn Ching, non-resident senior fellow at the Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center, whose work on China or in China's role in the Americas helps make sense of how we got here and where things may be headed. So let's dive in. Welcome, Victoria.
Hi, how are you, Stephanie? Thank you so much for having me here.
Well, it's great to have you. Victoria, to ground us at the very beginning of the series, how did China's early diplomatic outreach and political engagement in Latin America lay the foundation for partnerships we're seeing today?
I think to be able to answer the question, right, is that you have to think about when China became really active in Latin America. So to start off, we know that it started probably around the 1970s, right? Right when it became part of the United Nations. And you actually have many Latin American countries opening their doors in terms of diplomatic relationship with China. At the time, right, the purposes or the goals were more from a diplomatic perspective. Then we see a shift in the 1990s where China becomes to or starts to be more engaged in the region. And in this case, it is a very timid, let's say, commercial, right, and even less so investment engagement. Now, something to keep in mind, not only for people who study, China, Latin America, but Latin Americans themselves who want to look at China, is that a lot of these approximations from China to the region is highly related to its own national economic and political goals, right? So in the 1990s, we have the opening of its economy, right, in which it's seeking the internationalization of its companies. It is also seeking new markets, and Latin America was precisely a great place to start. And what we start seeing in the 2000s or the 21st century, right, is that not only it's a solidification of those economic and investment financial ties, but it's also an expansion of industries, expansion of the different kind of projects and sectors, right, that China wants to engage in, but also the expansion of countries. And we see that more in the last 10 years or so, where you see not only South American countries, because if you look at the entire trajectory, a lot of that economic engagement, a lot of that financial and investment engagement that everyone has seen in the media in the last 20 years, right? A lot of it was mainly concentrated, I would say, in South American countries. But in the last 10 years or so, you actually see a slow expansion to Central America and the Caribbean, for instance, right? So the way that I would say is that what we're seeing right now, it's basically a expansion. It is a solidification of the ties that already existed, and in many ways, it's also representative of the very shifts of China's foreign policy that's highly related to its own economic goals, its own political goals. Is that when we are thinking about how China presented itself and the kind of partnership, right, that China has had with Latin America since the 1990s and then the early 2000s, was pretty much presenting itself as an alternative option, right, as an alternative viable option, and also as a developing country, right, that was able to, let's say, reach a lot of the development and modernization goals that Latin American countries, for example, were seeking for, right? Again, back to the mutual cooperation, back to the South-South cooperation, back to the win-win situation.
And thinking about those transitions and the history that you've just shared with us, why do you think that China's role in Latin America is drawing so much attention right now? And to help our audience understand the broader concerns, What is fundamentally different about China's approach in the region compared to the United States or Europe?
Mhm. I think that, I mean, it has always garnered attention, especially in the 2000s, and a lot of it is precisely with due to the speed, right? That China became such an important partner for the regions. Now, obviously because of the themes that we have, we're focusing mostly on Latin America. So the speed in which it started expanding its ties, right? In just less than a decade, I would say it became a top three or top five economic or commercial partner. So that was, I think, unexpected for some of the for some of the more traditional partners. And what do I mean? Right? I mean, for example, like European partners or the United States. That's the first part. The second part, also the financial and capacity, right? The financial capacity of China coming in with large amounts of capital, right? And to a certain extent, infrastructure too, to really put these mega infrastructure projects, especially in the region. So that garnered a lot of attention.
Can you speak a little bit about Latin American conditions, governance, perhaps
Mm-hmm.
particular elements of the processes that are happening in the localities that underpin that rapid expansion?
If you think about it, so in the earlier years, if you think about the early, even in the 1990s, I mean, there were one or two projects, and even the early 2000s. I would have to say, from the Chinese side, there was a lot of lack of due diligence for a lot of the Chinese companies, right? So they would come in, and the plan was, here's the money, here's the capital, this is what I want. I want this project. I am going to these tenders where it was applicable, and this is where I'm going, right? So for a lot of the Latin American countries, they need it. They needed that. They needed that amount of money. They needed that kind of capital. They needed that kind of interest, right? And it took time to really figure out, okay, these are the rules of the host countries, and this is how you're supposed to work. But of course, in this case, right, the holding of accountability, the degree of governance, it's also depending on the host countries themselves, right? But when it comes to financing, for instance, and I think there was a lot of talk about that, especially in the mid 2000s, right? A lot of the financing and I guess the loans that many Chinese development banks and whatnot provided, uh, the conditions were more flexible in the sense that the timing, and another thing that I wanted to highlight, going back to your initial question, right, and what makes China different, is that it's very transactional, right? I think that's when we think about China, and for the last 20 years, we speak of China as a pragmatic partner, right, in Latin America, as a pragmatic partner, as one that in the early 90s and especially in the 2000s, right, it was, I just want to have the economic deal, or I just want to have the investment project and whatnot. I think that's something that we forget, is that it's also very transactional. It is a transactional partner, right, in the sense that I am not going to get involved, or by I mean China is not going to get involved, right? At least explicitly and covertly so in the politics of a country, because it doesn't need to, it doesn't have to, but rather, right, it wants the deal to happen. It wants the investment to happen. So in this case, it's very transactional in that regard. That's one part. The other part is that when you're thinking about how China interacts, is that it has and it continues to come as a partner that tells you, this is what I offer, this is what I want, right? And I think for a lot of Latin American countries, sometimes, right, they decide it's worth pursuing, right, in spite or regardless, rather, of the risk. And in many ways, I think that's where the region has learned and continues to learn, and sometimes due to the general environment of political instability and what have you, that we sadly, right, experience from time to time an economic crisis. When it comes to that, sometimes the reactions become a little bit more reactive. And I think here's where we are still as a region struggling, right? If we want to have a strategy to how to better negotiate and transact with China, right? Can we have a regional strategy, or is it going and continue to be more one by one, country by country.
How do you see that now evolving? How do you see that relationship evolving? And how do you see that maybe not just at a government level, but at a local, subnational, and community level, these
Mhm.
relationships or the relationship with Chinese investment um, is being portrayed, seen, and understood?
What people forget is that Latin American countries are actually agents on their own, right? They're decision makers on their own. So that is to say, um, they know that doing business, or at least a lot of the policymakers that I have experience in researching and some of which talk to and or interview for my work in many ways, right? Is that there is an awareness of the risks that come with, right, doing business with China or doing business with a I guess a country like China, or with Chinese firms that come with a specific kind of structure or respond to a specific, I guess, political system and what have you. What happens is that when they are the public tenders, right, because of the financial capacity that Chinese companies come with, because of the infrastructure that they come with, sometimes they actually win, right? And only that, the costs, they're much lower in comparison to their Western counterparts, right? So they're selected. But then the next layer comes in, right? One thing is to have those projects being approved. One thing is to have those projects obtained by Chinese firms. But then the next layer comes into how are they implemented? How are they enforced? And however you want to label this, right? A lot of it, or actually a good chunk of the weight, right, is dependent on the host countries and the local governments. When you are already having this interaction and whatnot, into how you hold these firms accountable, or how you make sure that everything that is discussed or negotiated doesn't stay just on paper, right? Or you also make sure that that if a project is going on, right, what are going to be the I guess in this case, when it comes to extractive industries, the social environmental effects and whatnot. And sadly, right, for many of these countries, given the nature of the industries, because that's another thing. I'm talking about China in general and whatnot, but a lot of the kind of projects and investments that China has in the region are still for natural resources, are still in commodities, right, and also are in industries, right, that have a heavy social environmental to a certain extent, I guess, economic impact. So the question is, how are these host countries, how are these different structures, right, or do they even have the structure to really hold not only the Chinese firms or the Chinese actors accountable, but also in general. And in many cases, right, unfortunately, we see I guess, a loosening of certain regulations and whatnot, right? Not necessarily because the company is Chinese, but because, for instance, the project is very important. Let's say for the national interest of the country or the economic interest of the country.
Going off of what you mentioned about the level of agency that local stakeholders have as well, what are the most visible effects that you see from Chinese infrastructure, energy, and mining projects? And how do you see that we can better, from a Latin America perspective, how do we better catalyze that level of agency in being able to counteract some of these effects?
I think a lot of, well, civil society is important, but also being strategic. Strategic in the sense of being clear about the not immediate effects or outcomes, but rather think about the medium and long term outcomes. The question is, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, how would it look like? Not only for the companies themselves and what they provide or not provide when it comes to tax revenues and what have you, but the communities themselves, right? And I think that having a good articulation of interest, not only from the communities that are affected, but also having civil society and also having local leaders, right? Actually governing, so improving governance, I guess that's what I'm trying to say. Improving governance, which is something that easier said than done, right? In many of our countries, because I think from the experience that we all have is that unfortunately, or or in a more limited way, the way that we can talk about it is that there is a fear, I think, a fear of elite capture, for example, right? There is a fear of I guess deepening the levels of corruption that many of our regions unfortunately do experience.
As we're thinking about this nuanced approach from both sides, right? From China to Latin America and vice versa, we see that some reports have shown a decline in Chinese foreign direct investment to the region, as LAC received only a little more than 1% of Beijing's global construction spending
Mhm.
and 0.4% of outbound investment in the first half of 2025. And China's dealing with its own domestic economic slowdown. What does this mean for China's role in Latin America over the next few years?
In many ways, it's very it's tight, right? Or tightly related rather
Mhm.
to its own national plans and economic plans and I guess for economic policy plans and also its global role. And I think that to pay attention, for example, to what it says this is why I mentioned the 5-year plan. It really shows, right, more or less what China could be looking for, or could be aiming for, or what we could target, for example, when looking at a region like Latin America or any other region. So, for instance, there is a reduction of investment precisely because I think that even following their own plans, right? China is aware, right, that it cannot just dump, right, projects everywhere or just dump money anywhere, but rather it needs to be more strategic, and that speaks to its own plans of modernization and industrialization and focusing on key industries, right? And precisely when it comes to Latin America, what we see is a focus on projects and on deals that are very strategic for its own, again, industrialization, modernization process. So there is, of course, an increase, and I think we can see that, right, into critical minerals. There is also great attention, for example, to information technology, digital technology, telecommunications. There is a lot of attention as well, right, in green technology or alternative energy. And that's precisely what we have seen. Not only that, it's also looking at poor infrastructure. And where do we see that? I am going to go for the partner that benefits me the most in certain aspects. And ideally, I want to interact with both, right? So there has been a degree of ambiguity and whatnot. And I think that time back to what I was saying earlier, right? The challenge for Latin American countries is that how they are now is like given these changes, how and given, let's say, the slowdown or the more strategic, I guess, coming of China with projects, right, that they're smaller perhaps, or they're more pointed at specific industries. The challenge would be how can they build up a relationship that, again, is not just reactive to what China can be offered, or reactive to, for example, the demands or the criticisms or the power balancing with other external players, right? But rather, how are they going to redefine this relationship in such a way that is more strategic, and again, not just reactive, but strategic, and also responding to the very domestic demands, right, and external demands that these countries, and by these countries, I mean Latin American countries, have.
You've spoken about the future. We've spoken about the need for a more strategic position and agency from Latin American countries or Latin American and the Caribbean countries. So, what are key aspects that you see that need to be in place for that strategy to happen? I know that you've mentioned um, public tenders that are sometimes focused on price more than value. You've addressed a few different topics. What do you see other than, of course, aligning on strategy and agency? Is there
Right.
anything else that underpins that key vision from Latin America and agency in this relationship?
I guess one of the bigger challenges that we have had as a region since the 80s. And that would be even more important today, given the industries that Chinese companies are focusing on, given the sectors or the interest rather, right, that China is interested in, for example, when it comes to innovation, when it comes to technology, green technology, which is something that the region is also interested in. It's how can countries in the region invest more. I know this is like a circular argument, but invest more, pay more attention to deals, I guess, right? That not only support the transfer of technology and skills, right? Knowledge, but also that can support in the country's position in the global value chains, right? Because thus far, I think that a lot of the region, I don't want to generalize in that way, but thus far and to a great degree, the way in which countries have been, let's say, negotiating with China has been as the source of the raw materials, right, or the source of these commodities and what have you, and I think that one of the challenges is precisely how do we move up from just being the source of these raw materials? How do we create the systems in such a way that there is, and again, that also comes with negotiation, right? So it's also about refining. It's also about processing, and I think that for some of the countries, right, they have been good. For instance, in countries that the circumstances change, like Mexico, like Brazil, and whatnot, right? With other partners, not necessarily China, but I think with China there is the space to talk a little bit more about that, or in that regard. And again, right, that goes back to our own job as a region into building those mechanisms, in building those systems that actually helps us into positioning ourselves, right, in different value chains, or in these global value chains, and to be able to offer products, or to offer elements that have value added.
So thinking ahead and with this in mind, these elements that you've brought up, how do you think that the renewed U.S. interest in the region will play a role in that conversation, that more strategic conversation that has to do with value or with value chains, right? How do you see that shifting, shaping, or adapting what that strategy looks like?
Unfortunately, it does force Latin American countries into getting away, not getting away, but actually stepping out from their position of ambiguity or non-alignment, and say, right, okay, which partner are you prioritizing more? Which is something that a lot of countries don't want to do, right? Or a lot of administrations don't want to do, because, like I said, at the end of the day, in the ideal world, is that they want to interact with both, and not just both, right? They want to interact with European countries as well, and other Asian partners even. I think that countries are being very cautious, right? And very cautious in how they're navigating, not just with China, but also with the United States. I mean, the examples that I gave you, right, speak of a China that negotiates, and countries are willing to work with because of the capital that they bring in, because of the, I guess, the deals that they can make, etc., etc. Therefore, like we have seen in the case of Ecuador, in the case of Venezuela, right, going back to the commodity backed loans, and then the countries, right, inevitably are faced with the scenario of having to give, for example, or send, for example, as because it was part of a collateral, right, oil, for instance, to China to pay back the debt, right? I think that there needs to be more nuance when talking about not just bilateral relationship at this point, but rather triangular relationship when it includes the United States, right? Even other partners. There needs to be more nuance, and I think that usually, especially circles in DC, is black or white, right? It's black or white, and And while there is concern, right, I'm not going to say that there is not. What there is concerns about dependency, for example, and whatnot. Again, that really also goes back not just what China's doing, but also asking
Mhm.
if some of these Latin American countries are aware of the risk, why are they choosing China, right? And I don't think that there is a blanket answer to that. Perhaps to a certain degree, it's the speed and the financial capacity that China's arrives to these countries, right? Speed in the sense that the capital will come fast, right? In comparison to and in large amounts, perhaps, right? But at the end of the day, is it just about that, or is there more to for example, right, the trade-offs that I was talking about? So this is precisely what I was talking about, the more medium long term scenarios that need to be calculated, or they need to be from a lot of the Latin American policymakers, definitely not on China, right? Regional or the regions, policymakers and decision makers, right? Is that what are the effects? Because even though, right, the administrations and the governments might change, right? How are we thinking about development? How are we thinking about, rather, how are we thinking about using China to support, let me put it that way, right? Using China to support the region's development, right, in the long term, and not just because it will make this specific administration more popular and whatnot, and then for the next one, what's happening?
Victoria, this has been fantastic. Thank you for kicking off our very first episode with such clear and grounded insight. You've helped set the stage for everything we're going to unpack in the rest of the series, and we're really grateful that you could join us. And to everyone listening, thanks for being here for episode 1 of Experts of the Americas China LAC series. We're just getting started. In the upcoming episodes, we'll dig deeper into the development shifts, the security questions, and the big picture geopolitical currents shaping China-Latin America relations. If you enjoyed this conversation, make sure to follow, subscribe, and stay tuned for what's coming next at theatlanticcouncil.org. And of course, follow us on social media to catch updates, bonus content, and announcements about future guests. We will see you next time.